What happens when the smallest eyes see the biggest lies? What happens when a warning is whispered by the innocent, but the wise are too deafened by greed to hear it? Is it possible for an entire community to walk blindly off a cliff, smiling all the way down, while a child screams for them to stop? In a peaceful village tucked between green hills and a singing river, a stranger arrived with pockets full of promises and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The wind stopped blowing the day he came. The birds stopped singing. But the adults didn't notice the silence, they only heard the jingle of gold coins. This isn't just a story about a village in danger. It is a story about the blindness of desperation and the terrifying clarity of innocence. It is a story about the courage it takes to stand alone when the whole world tells you to sit down. Before she became a legend in the whispers of the elders, she was just Destiny. A quiet 7-year-old girl who liked to sit under the baobab tree and listen to the earth breathe. She was small, unnoticed, and easily dismissed. But Destiny had a gift, or perhaps a curse. She could see the shadows that people hid behind their smiles. Welcome to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every truth demands to be heard. Now, before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Is it morning in Lagos, evening in Nairobi, or midnight in London? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to join our community of storytellers. Now, lean in. Take a deep breath. Because the shadow is already moving, and only one person can see it. The village of Goodwill was known for two things: the sweetness of its oranges and the unity of its people. For generations, fences were low, and hearts were open. If a man's roof leaked, his neighbor brought thatch before the rain fell. If a woman fell ill, 3 pots of soup would appear on her doorstep before sunset. It was a place where wealth was measured not by what you had in your pocket, but by who sat at your table. But hunger has a way of changing the shape of a man's soul, and the last 2 harvest seasons had been unkind. The rains were late, the oranges were sour, and worry had etched deep lines into the faces of the fathers. It was into this fragile, hungry silence that Mr. Frederick arrived. He came in a long, black car that hummed like a sleeping beast, the tires crunching over the red earth of the village square. He wore a suit the color of a stormy sky and shoes that shone so brightly they reflected the desperate faces of the villagers who gathered to watch him step out. Mr. Frederick did not come empty-handed. From the trunk of his car, his assistants pulled bags of rice, gallons of oil, and crates of strange, glittering drinks that no one in Goodwill had ever tasted. He stood before Elder Solomon and the village council, his voice smooth like warm honey poured over crushed glass. He told them he was a developer, a philanthropist, a man sent by destiny to turn their dusty paths into paved roads and their mud huts into mansions. He spoke of a factory he would build near the river, a factory that would turn their sour oranges into liquid gold for the world market. As he spoke, the men cheered, their chests puffing out with renewed hope. The women clapped, imagining their children in fine school uniforms. Elder Solomon, usually a man of caution, shook Mr. Frederick's hand with both of his, tears of gratitude glistening in his eyes. The village saw a savior, they saw the end of their suffering. But Destiny saw something else. While the other children scrambled for the sweets Mr. Frederick threw into the crowd, Destiny stood by the edge of the gathering, clutching her rag doll. She watched the stranger's shadow as it stretched across the red dust. To anyone else, it was just a shadow cast by the afternoon sun. But to Destiny, the shadow looked wrong. It did not match Mr. Frederick's movements. When he raised his hand to wave, the shadow seemed to claw at the ground. When he smiled, the shadow seemed to open a jagged maw. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, thinking it was a trick of the heat. But when she looked again, she saw a grey mist curling around his ankles, wilting the grass where he stood. A cold shiver, unnatural in the heat of the day, danced down her spine. She felt a sickness in her stomach, a primal warning that something ancient and hungry had just walked through their gates. Later that evening, the celebration fires were lit. Drums that had been silent for months woke up, their rhythmic pounding echoing against the hills. The adults drank the glittering drinks Mr. Frederick had brought, laughing louder than they had in years. Destiny sat near her father, Samuel, pulling at the hem of his trousers. "Papa," she whispered, her voice trembling. The man is cold. His shadow eats the grass." Samuel, flushed with wine and the promise of a job as the factory foreman, laughed heartily and patted her head. "Oh, my little Destiny," he boomed, his voice thick with unearned pride. "You have too much imagination. Mr. Frederick is a blessing. Look at this food. Look at your mother dancing. We are saved, child. Do not look for ghosts where there are angels." He turned back to his friends, raising a toast to the future, leaving Destiny alone in the noise. She slipped away from the light of the fires, guided by an unseen pull toward the riverbank. The moon was high, casting a silver path on the water. Usually, the river at night was a symphony of frogs and crickets, a lullaby that the village slept to. But tonight, the river was strangely silent. Destiny knelt by the muddy bank. The water, usually clear, looked oily and thick. As she watched, a single, dead fish floated to the surface, its belly white and bloated. Then another. And another. The wind rustled through the reeds, and to Destiny's sensitive ears, it sounded like a gasp for air. She looked back toward the village, where the sparks of the bonfire rose into the night sky, and realized with a terrifying certainty that the laughter of her people was the sound of a funeral procession beginning. 3 weeks passed, and the transformation of Goodwill was swift and dazzling. Construction trucks roared through the quiet lanes, tearing up the earth to lay foundations for the new factory. Men who once farmed the land now wore yellow helmets and marched to the backing orders of Mr. Frederick's supervisors. They were paid in cash, crisp, clean notes that felt alien in their calloused hands. With the money came new things, loud generators that choked the evening air with smoke, televisions that flickered in every window, and plastic toys that broke after a day. The village looked richer. The huts were being replaced by block houses. But underneath the fresh paint and the noise of progress, a rot was spreading. The people were changing, too. The neighbor who used to share his thatch now built a high wall topped with broken glass. The women who used to cook together now argued over whose husband earned more at the factory. Greed, like a subtle infection, had entered the bloodstream of Goodwill. Destiny watched her father, Samuel, wither away. He brought home money, yes, but he also brought home a cough that rattled deep in his chest. His skin, once dark and rich like mahogany, had turned a pale, ashy gray. He was irritable, snapping at Destiny's mother for small mistakes, his eyes always darting around as if he were afraid someone would steal his new wealth. Destiny tried to show him the garden in their backyard. The yam tendrils were yellow and limp, and the cassava tubers she dug up were black and mushy inside. "Papa, the ground is sick," she pleaded one morning as he hurried to leave. "The food tastes like metal. We should not eat it." Samuel shoved her aside, his patience thin. "Ungrateful child," he shouted, startling her. "Do you want to go back to starving? This is the price of development. The dust from the trucks kills a few plants, so what? We buy our food from the city now. Stop speaking nonsense." The isolation was suffocating. Destiny felt like she was the only one awake in a house full of sleepwalkers. She stopped playing with the other children because they had become cruel, mimicking the arrogance of their parents. They threw stones at the stray dogs and laughed when the animals yelped, a cruelty that had never existed in Goodwill before. Destiny spent her days tracking the source of the grey mist she still saw clinging to the village. She noticed that the trucks from the factory didn't just bring building materials in, they took barrels of dark, slushing liquid out and dumped them into the sacred grove upstream, the place where the ancestors were buried. The adults knew this. They had to know. But they looked away, their eyes fixed on the payday at the end of the week. They traded their heritage for comfort, and the land was screaming in pain. The breaking point came when Elder Solomon announced the grand signing. Mr. Frederick had prepared a contract that would officially sell the communal land, the river, the grove, the farms, to his company forever. In exchange, every family would receive a lump sum that seemed like a fortune. A massive feast was planned for the signing ceremony. Destiny knew, with a wisdom far beyond her years, that once that paper was signed, the soul of Goodwill would be gone. The grey mist would swallow them whole. That night, she heard her parents whispering. "It feels wrong, Samuel," her mother said softly. "The water smells like death." "Quiet, woman," Samuel hissed. "Tomorrow we sign, and we leave this backward life behind. Do not ruin this for me." Destiny lay in her bed, tears hot on her cheeks. She realized that words would no longer work. The adults were under a spell, intoxicated by gold. Driven by a desperate courage, Destiny slipped out of her window before dawn. She needed proof. Something so undeniable that even the blinded adults couldn't ignore it. She ran toward the sacred grove, her small feet pounding against the hard earth. The air grew heavy and foul as she approached the upstream bend. There, where the ancient Iroko tree stood, the tree that was said to hold the spirit of the village, she saw the horror. The massive tree was weeping. Thick, black sludge oozed from its bark, pulling at its roots. The ground around it was dead, littered with the carcasses of birds and squirrels. And standing there, in the pre-dawn gloom, was Mr. Frederick. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was chanting in a language that hurt Destiny's ears, and the grey mist was pouring out of his mouth, feeding into the black sludge. He wasn't a developer. He was a harvester of life, feeding on the destruction of the land. Destiny gasped, snapping a dry twig. Mr. Frederick spun around, his eyes glowing a terrifying red. The sun rose over Goodwill, but it gave no warmth. The light was pale and sickly, filtered through a haze of dust. The village square was set for the grand signing. Tables were draped in colorful cloths, laden with imported food and wine. Mr. Frederick, back in his pristine suit and smiling his plastic smile, sat at the head table next to Elder Solomon. The entire village was gathered, dressed in their finest clothes, buzzing with the nervous energy of anticipation. The contract lay on the table, a crisp white document that promised everything and at the cost. Elder Solomon picked up the pen. The crowd held its breath. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of the irrevocable choice they were about to make. Samuel stood in the front row, his arm around his wife, his eyes fixed greedily on the pen. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream pierced the air. "Stop! Do not sign!" The crowd turned as one. Emerging from the bush path was Destiny. She was a shocking sight. Her dress was torn, her legs were covered in black mud, and her face was streaked with sweat and tears. She clutched something wrapped in a large leaf against her chest. "Destiny!" Samuel roared, stepping forward, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. "Go home immediately. How dare you interrupt the elders?" He moved to grab her, but Destiny dodged him, scrambling onto the main table, knocking over a bottle of expensive wine. It shattered, the red liquid pooling like blood on the white cloth. The crowd gasped. Mr. Frederick stood up, his smile faltering for a split second. "Get this brat out of here," he snarled, his voice losing its honeyed tone. Destiny stood tall on the table, looking small against the angry adults but giants in her spirit. "Look," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Look at what you are selling." She ripped open the leaf she was holding. Inside was a chunk of the root from the sacred Iroko tree. It was black, pulsating, and oozing the foul-smelling sludge. The stench hit the crowd instantly, a smell of rotting flesh and old graves. It was the smell of death. "He is killing the ancestors," Destiny cried, pointing a shaking finger at Mr. Frederick. "He is poisoning the water. Look at the root. It is bleeding." She squeezed the root, and the black sludge dripped onto the contract, sizzling as it burned through the paper. The crowd recoiled. The smell was undeniable. It cut through the perfume and the smell of money, triggering a deep, ancestral memory in the villagers. Elder Solomon stared at the burning paper, then at the black rot on the table. He looked at Mr. Frederick, and for the first time, he truly saw him. He saw the coldness in his eyes, the lack of sweat on his brow despite the heat. Samuel froze, looking at his daughter's terrified but defiant face. He looked at the sludge, recognizing the smell from the water he had forced himself to drink. The spell began to crack. It's poison," a woman whispered. "My baby has this rash," another shouted. "The crops," a man yelled. The murmur turned into a roar. Mr. Frederick's face twisted into a mask of pure malice. "You fools," he bellowed, his voice booming supernaturally loud. "I offered you the world, and you chose death." But the village had woken up. Samuel stepped forward, not as a greedy man, but as a father. He climbed onto the table and stood between the stranger and his daughter. "We choose life," Samuel said, his voice steady. He picked up the heavy ceremonial staff of the village and pointed it at the road. "Leave. Now." The villagers surged forward, united not by greed this time, but by a fierce protective rage. They didn't use weapons, they used their presence, their unity, a wall of human will pushing the darkness back. Mr. Frederick looked at the wall of people, then at the little girl whose eyes burned with a pure, white light. He hissed, a sound like escaping steam, and retreated. He got into his black car and sped away, the dust swallowing him. As he left, the grey mist lifted. The air suddenly felt lighter. Destiny collapsed into her father's arms, weeping, and for the first time in months, Samuel cried too, holding his treasure close. The factory was never built. The money Mr. Frederick brought turned to dust, literally disintegrating in their boxes a few days later. Goodwill remained a village of mud huts and red earth for a long time. They were poor in pocket, but they were alive. The river took a year to clear, but eventually, the fish returned. The Iroko tree healed, and the oranges grew sweet again. This isn't just a story about escaping a scam. It is a lesson about the cost of things that shine too brightly. Destiny never became a chief, nor was she given a throne. But every time the elders gathered, they would ask for her opinion before making a decision. Not because she was rich, but because she had eyes that saw the truth when everyone else was blinded by desire. And a heart that chooses truth over treasure, and integrity over influence, will always be the richest heart in the room. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone you love, and tell me in the comments, have you ever felt a warning in your spirit that everyone else ignored? Did you listen to it? Subscribe to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every ending brings a lesson worth remembering. This is Stories by the King, where love wins, and purpose finds its home.